Well, then, Christmas may be one of the most joyous occasions for many people, but for others, the holiday period brings with it feelings of anxiety, loneliness, and even depression. We can speak about this now with Viwe Dweba, who's a psychologist. Viwe, a very good evening to you. Grateful for your time as we go into the long weekend, especially many people already on holiday. But let's begin with, at a very basic level, why a time that on paper should bring about so much joy, reunions, and happiness actually brings about anxiety, stress, and even depression.
Hi, Timbegile. Thank you for having me. So the festive season is something that we generally associate with good times. But the reality is that a lot of people are firstly experiencing the first loss, for instance, after having lost a family member. This is the first festive season without this person that one has lost. Family, it is a privilege to have family that is a safe space, but often a lot of people don't have families that are safe for them, especially with our LGBTQ community. Home is not safe. A lot of people have been ostracized from home, or home is a homophobic space, or home is the place where a perpetrator of, violence or sexual violence, intimate partner violence, whatever that is, home is associated with abuse. And so because home is not a safe place, or home is a place associated with grief, you find that a lot of people are really struggling with loneliness. And some people can't go home for the holidays because they have to work, because of course this is such a compromised economic situation that we're in right now as a country, especially after COVID. So a lot of people don't have the privilege to be able to go home for the holidays. They have to work through the holidays.
I want to touch on what you're talking about there around grief. Many people, yes, have lost loved ones in the last year due to various causes, but this is also the first festive season that we're all able to travel freely not post the pandemic, because we're still technically in a pandemic, but it's the first time since COVID that people are able to go home. Many will have missed funerals of loved ones in the last 2 years, and to go home will be quite overwhelming.
Yes, of course. Going home after so much time, and there are a lot of traditions in family or customs in family around having to visit the graves of those whose funerals you haven't been able to go to, and that can come with its own anxiety and with its own sadness.
Viwe, are you still with us? Okay.
And home, again, as I was saying, so much loss.
We've got you back, Viwe. Yes, we've got you back. You're talking about traditions and how all of that culminates in this stress and anxiety. Yes,
so there are a lot of traditions, and there can be sort of that anxiety around visiting those graves, anxiety around having to, have the financial capacity to see to certain rituals and certain traditions that we generally do at the end of the year, because it's a working year, it doesn't allow for us to do that. So there can be that additional anxiety around financials.
And at a very basic level, I mean, if you work like most of us do in the city and you go home at the end of the year, it's expensive enough to go home. But, for example, if you're a primary breadwinner who sends money home throughout the year, there's also an expectation that when you arrive with enough spending money for not just yourself, but everyone else. How do we begin to have those conversations, even with our relatives back home, without anyone being hurt, but also not burying ourselves under further financial pressure and stress?
So I think this is the difficult thing. Because we people please often, it can be difficult to set that financial boundary for ourselves. So I think the thing that's important is not to consider sort of the idea of hurting someone's feelings because you're saying you don't have capacity. Of course, you're a human being with warmth and kindness, and you will think about that, but that's often driven by feelings of shame. That, well, if I'm supposed to be someone who made it, who's working in the city, why is it that I'm not able to provide for my family to this extent? So it's important to communicate that financial barrier, those financial constraints before you even go home, because often people enter into debt or go into January's income to try to accommodate December's increased expenditure. So an important thing is about setting that boundary firstly with yourself, before you go home, and then communicating it before you go home as well to manage expectations.
I ask this question, I think, every year whenever we have these conversations, because we have them annually around the holiday period. That's the conversation of understanding when you've just got the holiday blues, if you're just stressed for a period of time, and when you actually have to see a doctor because it's something more serious. How do we know?
So what we're looking at when we're looking at what it is that we're struggling with, when we're looking for a diagnosis that needs intervention, is we're looking at severity, we're looking at impact on functioning, and we're looking at the time period. So to diagnose depression, you need to have experienced those symptoms for a period of 2 weeks or more. And we're looking at symptoms such as a low mood, or what we sort of think of as sadness, for most days during the week. So for most of the time you're feeling low. We're looking at, in decreased energy levels. So feeling fatigued, disturbed sleep, sleep that's not restful, feeling tired as you're waking up, forgetfulness, struggling to concentrate on anything, feelings of hopelessness, feelings of worthlessness. And at times it can be so severe that it becomes suicidal ideation. Mm-hmm. So if you're experiencing all of those things for at least 2 weeks, then we're looking at a diagnosis that needs intervention. Nice. But it's also perfectly expected to experience grief almost afresh during the holiday period when you have lost a loved one, and this is the first Christmas you're experiencing without them.
Speak to us about suicidal ideation, what it is and what it looks like. How does it present?
So the first thing is it's important not to judge suicidal ideation. What that is thinking. It's basically the need to escape the difficulty or the pain that you are in right now. So it's passive thinking of suicidality. So things such as wishing that, if I wasn't here, things would be so much easier. People would be better off without me. Sort of those passive thoughts around, if I could just get into a car accident, then I wouldn't have to deal with any of these things because I wouldn't be here. And then we're going into more active ideation. If I did this or that to myself. And then we're looking at that ideation with intent, where you're thinking, this is what I wish I could do this to myself. This is, I'm actually thinking I want to do something to myself. And then the last is when we're really quite worried, and you do need to present yourself at your nearest hospital or call SADAG or Lifeline, for help, is when you start to have a plan that, I wish I could escape this. This is what I would do. I am going to do this. So it happens in degrees, and it's important to track that for yourself. And if you're not feeling safe, get yourself to your nearest hospital, or you can contact someone that you love and trust who can support you through that.
And the experience doesn't always look the same or follow the same chronology for everyone, right? For those people who do take their own lives around this time of year, for surviving loved ones, the questions are around, what did I miss? Is there anything that I could have done differently? Why did they do it? This word comes up a lot. It's a selfish act. But how should we be making sense of that if you do lose a loved one through suicide, especially at this time of year?
I think it's really important to remember that when someone is experiencing the desire to take their own lives, that is a place that is very desperate and that is very dark. And there's no way that you can pull someone out there sort of magically or pull them out yourselves because they're not okay. And in that moment, it's a moment of just complete despair and hopelessness that things could never get better. And that sort of act of taking your own life is often viewed by society, and of course loved ones understandably as something selfish, that should never have happened. But it's important to remember that we can never truly understand the pain someone is in. What that is when you start thinking, when you start having suicidal ideation, it's a cry for help. So as the family members of those who have perhaps taken their own lives, it's important to still sort of commemorate the person's life. It could be about thinking about them, having an evening or an afternoon or a short time where you remember the person, remember them as they were, remember what they brought to your life and the light they brought, because often the memory of someone can be completely darkened by how they have left us. So it's incredibly important for firstly us to work through those feelings that are okay and they are natural. And if you can find some grief support groups, or you can go to your own therapy or counseling, that would be really helpful, because it's such a traumatic way to lose a loved one. But I think it is important to remember that loved one, because often, where there has been a loss due to suicide, the entire memory of the person can really be darkened.
Viwe Dweba, a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us on this very important issue tonight.